EVO. Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is Sean Sellers, The Making of a Killer. Before the blood, before the headlines, there was a boy. Sean Richard Sellers was born on May 18, 1969, in Corcoran, California, a sun-bleached town steeped in the grit of the San Joaquin Valley. His early years were marked not by tragedy, but transience. His family moved frequently, chasing opportunity, leaving their roots shallow. His biological father vanished early. His mother, Vonda, remarried a trucker named Lee Bellafato, and together they moved to Oklahoma. So Sean was raised on the dry winds of Amarillo and the scorched blacktop of Oklahoma City. He was smart, uncannily so, but it was a sharpness edged in glass, thin, brittle, and ready to shatter. Even as a child, there were signs. Sean's imagination was vivid, but often unsettling. His early fixations on comic book heroes morphed into something darker. Vampires, gothic horror, the macabre. He grew fascinated by tales of possession and power, of creatures lurking just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. Teachers noted his artistic talents, but also his growing isolation. His notebooks became cluttered with morbid drawings, figures with hollow eyes, pentagrams carved in ink, spells written phonetically in the margins. His mother brushed it off. Boys will be boys. A phase. But Sean was slipping, slowly and with little resistance, into a world that would not forgive him. At 15, he discovered Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible. Not by accident, but as if called to it. He didn't just read it, he consumed it. Dog-eared pages, underlined passages, scribbled commentary. He believed it spoke to him directly. The book promised agency. It promised power. It said that man was his own God, and Sean, lost and directionless, was hungry to believe it, not unlike Tommy Sullivan. With a friend named Richard Howard, he began performing rituals. Mock ceremonies at first. Candles flickering in suburban bedrooms, knives dulled and harmless. They involved demons. They cast protection spells and wrote blood oaths. Sean took a new name, Ezurate, the demon prince of death. They claimed to worship Satan, but in truth, they worshipped the illusion of control. And Sean's appearance shifted to match his new faith. He wore black eyeliner, dark trench coats, pentagrams drawn on his sneakers. He was theatrical, he was provocative, and he was alone. At school, classmates ridiculed him. Teachers, unsure how to even address his spiraling behavior, either punished him or just ignored him. And at home, things were worse. Vonda struggled with alcohol, and her relationship with Bellafato had grown volatile. Sean felt like a ghost in his own life. He was spoken to only when he was being shouted at, and noticed only when he was in trouble. He began keeping a journal, pages and pages of rambling thoughts, spell work, confessions. He wrote of a figure who visited him in his dreams, a dark man, a voice, a promise. He said it told him to do things. Sleepwalking episodes began. He'd wake up in strange places, hallways, backyards, occasionally clutching items that he didn't remember collecting. His journal entries became more frantic, more fragmented. Some seemed to be in different handwriting, some in languages he didn't consciously know. At 16, he began telling people he was no longer entirely himself, that another force had taken residence in him. He claimed possession, not in jest, not in fantasy, but as fact. he named the entity Ezurate, no longer a character in a game, but something real, something that lived in his skin. The rituals intensified. Blood sacrifices, initially small animals, began to appear in Sean's writings. He referenced fire circles, spoken pacts, midnight prayers to unseen deities. Howard, his companion in these rites, would later describe them as increasingly frightening. The boy he'd once joked with had become a different person. Cold, distant, haunted even. Sean also began experimenting with drugs. Soon, speed became his crutch, an amphetamine cocktail that kept his mind racing and his soul restless. He would stay up for days on end, speaking of the apocalypse, of spiritual wars, of the destiny he believed had been placed upon him. His relationship with his parents frayed beyond repair. Belifato had little patience for the boy's dramatics, and Vonda, consumed by her own struggles, was ill-equipped to intervene. Sean felt hunted by shadows and ignored by light. He began stealing, he began lying, threatening those around him. His friends distanced themselves, teachers just gave up. His writings took on a violent edge. He described stabbing someone, though it was unclear if it had actually happened. He dreamed of fire, of blood. And then came the murder of Robert Paul Brower. Sean shot Brower, a convenience store clerk, during a robbery in September of 1985. He would later claim he did it under the influence of a demon, that he was compelled by Ezurate. But that night, it wasn't rage. It was ritual. It was a planned event. He had worn his pentagram. He had drawn sigils on his body. The boy who'd once whispered spells in his room had crossed a threshold. From fascination to action. From fantasy to felony. The police investigation would allegedly lead right back to Sean. But before the law caught up with them, something even more horrific occurred. In March of 1986, Sean crept into the home he shared with his parents and shot both Vonda and Lee as they slept. 2 bullets each, point blank. No struggle, no mercy. He later claimed he was possessed, that, again, Ezurate had demanded a sacrifice. His parents were in the way of his spiritual destiny. The police, however, saw it very differently. They saw a teenager with a growing obsession, a shrinking conscience, and a trail of bodies. By the time Sean Sellers was arrested, the headlines were already writing themselves. Teen Satanist kills own parents, the media pronounced. The Satanic Panic was reaching its peak in America, and Sean was its new poster child. But behind the flashing cameras and moral outrage was still a boy who wrote about dreams, about feeling lost, about wanting more than anything else to matter. And somewhere deep in the echo chamber of his fractured mind, that boy still listened. To the wind, to the dark, to the voice of Ezurate. Chapter 2, A Pact in Blood. September 8th, 1985. The night was unremarkable. The Oklahoma sky, thick with late summer heat, pressed down on a city that hadn't yet gone to sleep. At the edge of a quiet neighborhood in Oklahoma City, fluorescent lights flickered above a modest Circle K convenience store. Inside, behind the counter, stood 35-year-old clerk Robert Paul Brower. A man who had just started this new job a few weeks earlier, settled into a rhythm of long hours and solitude beneath the buzz of electric light. 2 teenagers entered the store that night. One of them was Sean Sellers, the other Richard Hauer. Neither boy looked threatening, just kids really, restless and pale, carrying too much energy for that hour. But beneath Sean's coat was the .357 Magnum revolver. It felt heavy in his hand, loaded not just with bullets, but with intention. Sean raised the gun. A single shot, a hollow boom that echoed between the snack aisles and the magazine rack. Robert Paul Bauer collapsed behind the counter, killed instantly by that bullet that tore through his skull. No demands, no words, just death. The motive, according to police, seemed depressingly ordinary. Petty theft, beer, a night of mischief gone wrong. But when investigators questioned Sean, he offered something else entirely. He said it was a sacrifice. A ritual offering to Ezurate, the demon he claimed resided within him, the force that guided his hand. He'd killed not out of impulse or greed, but out of spiritual obedience. Blood was the currency. Death was the devotion. The police were baffled. There was no robbery, nothing had been taken, the cash drawer was untouched, and there was no discernible connection between Sean Sellers and his victim. The case, for a time, went cold, but Sean Sellers wasn't finished. March 5th, 1986. It was a Wednesday, and the air in Oklahoma City hung heavy with anticipation. Spring was coming. Winter was dying. In a quiet, single-story home in the suburbs, Vonda Bellafato and her husband, Lee, lay sleeping. Their son, Sean, 16 years old, was not sleeping. He waited in the dark until just past midnight. He still owned the revolver, was still loaded. He moved silently down the hallway, his footsteps soft on the carpet, the house quiet enough to hear his own breath. He entered their bedroom. Vonda, his mother, the woman who had rocked him to sleep, who had cried through each of his tantrums, who had watched helplessly as her son descended into darkness. Lee, his stepfather, the man who tried, in his own gruff way, to provide some structure, who had driven long-haul routes to put food on the table. Sean shot them both. His mother in the face, Lee in the chest. They never stirred, they never moved. Death was immediate. Sean lingered only long enough to remove the shell casings. He staged the scene and walked away. The next day, he was the one who called the police. His voice trembled. He cried. He told them that someone had broken in, that he'd come home to find them dead. And he played the part, grieving, confused, desperate. But it didn't hold, not for long. Within days, cracks formed. The tears felt forced. The timelines didn't quite match. And friends began to speak, quietly at first, but then with growing concern. They had seen Sean light candles, recite incantations. They spoke of rituals, of mock executions, invocations scrawled in notebooks, pentagrams drawn in blood. They said Sean had become obsessed with death, with power, with the idea of murder. A search of his bedroom turned up a satanic altar, ritual tools, writings, a journal meticulously kept, filled with musings on evil, on plans for sacrifice, and confessions. When police confronted him, Sean cried again. But then he laughed. But then he cried once more. And that led to a confession. To all of it. But he claimed something else too. He said that he wasn't responsible. Not really. Ezurate was responsible. The demon had done it, he insisted. He had been possessed. His body was merely a vessel. It was a defense that horrified some, but had intrigued others. The Satanic Panic, that cultural firestorm already crackling through the American psyche, had found fresh fuel in Sean Sellers. Television anchors spoke of teen Satanists. Newspapers printed headlines soaked in panic. Religious leaders warned of a war for America's youth. And here was proof, they said. Evil's real. It has faces, it has names. It wears eyeliner and black trench coats and chants in candlelit bedrooms. Here was a killer, but worse, a child killer. A boy who had not only taken a stranger's life, but his own mother's. A boy who claimed allegiance not to country or God or conscience, but to something infernal. And here was the nation staring at its reflection in Sean Sellers' eyes and seeing darkness looking back. The trial would come, the headlines would multiply, the questions would mount. Was Sean Sellers crazy? Was he evil? Was he a victim? Or was he something new altogether? One thing was certain. The murders had stopped, but the story had just begun. This is Chapter 3, The Trial of a Child. The trial of Sean Sellers began on a cold January morning in 1987. Snow dusted the steps of the Oklahoma County Courthouse, a gray, rectangular monument to justice in a city struggling with its own shadow. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed, lawyers whispered over yellow legal pads, and reporters jostled for front row seats. Now, cameras weren't allowed, but the flashbulbs in the hallway pulsed like lightning, capturing the face of a killer who still had acne in the frame of a boy. Sean Sellers, slim, pale, shackled at the wrist, was 17 years old. The charges were grim. The murder of his mother, his stepfather, and a convenience store clerk named Robert Paul Bauer. 3 deaths, each one cold, calculated, and, if you believe the prosecution, ritualistic. District Attorney Bob Macy, a towering figure in Oklahoma law enforcement, delivered the opening salvo. He portrayed Sean as a vessel of evil, a boy who had traded his soul to Satan and received bloodlust in return. The jury, a mix of farmers, homemakers, and retirees, sat transfixed. It wasn't just a murder case. This was an exorcism. They played Sean's confession. In it, he spoke with a calm detachment that chilled the room. He described the night he killed Robert Bauer, referring to it as a, quote, necessary sacrifice. He said Ezurate, his personal demon, had demanded blood. Then he described slipping into his parents' bedroom, how the revolver shook in his hand, how his mother's eyes opened just as he pulled the trigger. The courtroom recoiled. One juror wept, another turned pale, but the defense wasn't silent. Sean's attorney, Retta Strubar, laid out a different picture. A boy who had slipped through the cracks of society, mental illness untreated, emotional trauma ignored. They brought in psychologists who testified that Sean exhibited clear signs of dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. One doctor described Sean as fragmented, fractured into selves, with Ezurate among them. Yet the prosecution countered with steely efficiency. They argued Sean's satanic identity was a performance, a teenage fantasy twisted into justification. They claimed the mental illness defense was an act supported by selective evidence and too convenient timing. Judge Charles Owens ruled against allowing a full insanity defense. It would be up to the jury to decide what was real and what was not. Sean's journals were read aloud. In looping, feverish handwriting, he wrote about darkness, he wrote about sacrifice, and he wrote about power. He imagined transforming into a demon, invulnerable to bullets and flames. He described dreams of tearing through crowds with claws and teeth. In one passage, he wrote, quote, "I was born a prince of hell, raised in flesh. Blood is my right." The press descended like vultures. Headlines read, "Satan teens killer on trial," "Boy possessed faces death," and "The devil in Oklahoma." But behind the headlines, behind the fear and fascination, stood a question that has haunted American justice for decades. Can a child be truly evil? And if so, should he die for it? After just a few weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom fell silent. Some expected relief, others horror. And then came the sentence. Death. Sean Sellers became the youngest person on death row in the United States at the time. The only juvenile offender in America with a death sentence for a crime committed at age 16. Outside the courthouse, the wind howled across the plains. Reporters packed up, protesters from both sides, victims' rights groups, and anti-death penalty activists stood in grim opposition. But the story was no longer just about Sean. It was about law, it was about conscience, and it was about the uneasy intersection of youth and justice. Sean was sent to Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, to a block known simply as H Unit. There, behind layers of steel and concrete, he vanished from public view. But the silence would not last. In the years that followed, Sean Sellers would reinvent himself. He would renounce Satanism, he would embrace Christianity, and become an unlikely symbol for mercy and rehabilitation. But in January 1987, all that lay ahead. For now, the boy who claimed to be a demon sat alone in his cell, awaiting death and awaiting history. Have you ever seen the devil in a child's smile? Email us at info@evocreative.com and make sure you're following The Devil Within Pod on Instagram. And leave a review, especially if you've ever heard someone else's voice coming from your own mouth. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.